Okay, let's talk about paraphrasing. Paraphrasing is one of probably the most important things you can learn for good scientific writing because you have to cite a lot of, almost everything that you're doing in the intro portion of any scientific paper is like reciting. I really want to say reciting, reporting on previous research. And if you're reporting on previous research, you have to paraphrase it. You can't quote it. We shouldn't be quoting it. You can't, um, obviously, you can't just lift it from there. That's plagiarism. So you have to be paraphrasing. So it's absolutely one of the key things that you're going to do in scientific writing. So let's take a look. It's not moving. There we go. So let's take a look at this. Um, okay. So what you're going to have to do in writing is anything that's not common knowledge gets cited, right? So I don't know. Summer is warmer than winter. Everybody knows this. You don't need to cite it. Water is wet. You don't need to cite that. It's made up of H2O. You probably don't need to cite that either. The sky is blue. You don't need to cite that. But if you're talking about other things that come directly from other papers, like what specifically clinical depression is, or what does what are the ways to um, diagnose, let's say, autism? How are you deciding on a speech disorder when you're looking at percent of consonants correct? Anything like that has to be cited. So you're going to want to have that in your introduction. That's definitely something that you're going to want to talk about. But you have to cite it and you have to report it in the correct way. So the way that you're going to cite these things, you're going to report on the research or the finding or the fact or whatever it is. And then you're going to have to cite the authors and the year that it was published at the very end. So it's going to, it's going to look just like this right here. You'll have words, blah, 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 and then parentheses, author, year. If there's two authors, it's author and author, comma, year. Um, so if you cite this is an issue that I see often with scientific writing is that when you've cited something, some people think that means that you can just use that sentence directly. So I can take this sentence from this paper because I'm citing it, and that means it's not plagiarism, which isn't true. It's definitely still plagiarism. So you can't just take a sentence. You also can't take part of a sentence. It all has to be summarized completely in new words. So again, just because you've cited something doesn't mean that now you have the okay to use another author's writing. Okay, let's keep going. We also don't want to quote. So if you can't directly use what someone else has said, even though you're citing it, and you can't quote, there's only one thing left. Why do we not quote? Well, because it's just not something that's done in most scientific papers. Quoting is great in English. Originally, I was an English major, and so they teach you to do this all the time, right? You need to show exactly the right imagery that the author has used and stuff like that because it's all artistic, right? Like if you're talking about English or something that people are using, it's art. So every piece of the sentence is crafted as part of the art. And so you have to quote it. Summarizing it just doesn't really do the trick. But scientific writing is not crafted the same way. Scientific writing is there for utility and precision. It also should be there for clarity, although not every scientific writer is very clear, which you certainly know because you've read some of these papers. It should be clear. It should be precise, clear, utilitarian. It doesn't need to be quoted because it's just stated in as clear of a way as the author could say it. The ideas need to be quoted, and the way you quote the ideas is by citing the author. But you don't need to quote actually, like, don't quote things from papers. Instead, paraphrase. So what paraphrasing is just restating the sentence or the paragraph or an entire study in your own words. So you can take an entire study, condense it down to one sentence that you've summarized. That's paraphrasing. Take an entire paragraph that someone's written, summarize it. You've paraphrased it. Take a sentence that someone has written, re-summarize that sentence, and you've paraphrased it. Usually, you're not going to do this with just one sentence because in a paper that you're writing, you're citing, in this class, it's going to be 4 papers in the beginning, and then it's going to be 8. And if you're doing something like the papers that I write, it's like 50 some papers that you're citing over the course of one paper. If I was paraphrasing every sentence, papers would be thousands of pages long, and they're not. They're like 10. So really what I'm doing is paraphrasing an entire paper or a section of a paper into one sentence, maybe 2 or 3 papers together into one sentence. So it's not as crazy as just like, as you think it could be when you think like, every sentence, every important sentence in this paper, I'm going to paraphrase and put into my paper. No. You don't have to do that. Like a section of it. The results section says all this stuff. Really all you need to know is like, hey, percent consonant correct over 80% probably doesn't mean there's a speech problem. So then you're going to put that in. Okay, so here's an example. This comes from a paper by Patton and Macbeth. I'm the Patton. Hooray. From 2022. It says, for the vocalizations trying to replicate the high 6 kilohertz tone. Actually, I just see now there should be a space between 6 and kilohertz. And this got published somehow. Whoops. The E phoneme was chosen 65% of the time, and the average phoneme tone height along the E continuum was 0.75. That's not really something you need to know about. The first part is, for the vocalizations trying to replicate the low 80 hertz tone, the phoneme was chosen 68% of the time. And then there's stuff about tone height. So let's go through that again with just what you need to know. For the vocalizations trying to replicate the high 6,000 kilohertz tone, the E phoneme was chosen 65% of the time. For the vocalizations trying to replicate the low 80 hertz tone, the phoneme was chosen 68% of the time. How would you summarize what I just said if you were going to put it into your paper? Well, go ahead and pause the video right now. Think about it. Come up with a way that you would summarize it. And this is what I've got. When participants replicate high-pitched tones, they tend to use E phonemes, but when they replicate low-pitched tones, should say tones, participants use the phoneme. When participants replicate the high-pitched tones, they tend to use the E phoneme, but when they replicate low-pitched tones, participants use the phoneme. And then you cite it, Patton and Macbeth, 2022. That's it. That's paraphrasing. You haven't plagiarized anything. And also, you haven't quoted anything. But like you can see, like I wrote this thing above, the original. There's nothing in there that's like so fantastic that it needs to be quoted. Like it's whatever. I like this other one that I wrote down here better. But whatever. Okay, here's another one. It's from another one of my papers. It's just easy to grab my own papers. But one thing that I'll point out is this is DeRoche, Knowles, Patton, Garcia, and Macbeth. There's 5 authors here, and you're not going to cite all 5 of those authors. That's something that we talked about in another video, but just something to note here. Okay, so what does it say? Also of note is our finding of significant cross-feature correlations between drum and vocal phrases. Correlations between the fundamental frequency of drum and vocal phrases and those between intensity demonstrate that the drum can be used as a surrogate in both talking and singing modes as mentioned. However, the significant correlation between vocal fundamental frequency and drum intensity may indicate a perceptual correlation between fundamental frequency and intensity in speech surrogacy drumming. Similarly, the use of drum intensity to indicate fundamental frequency changes in speech suggests that drummers are collapsing the highly multidimensional qualities of speech into a few dimensions that can be captured by doon-doon drumming. So how would you summarize that? I didn't mean to hit the... well, whatever. This is how you'd summarize it. Talking drums mimic speech because they closely match the pitch and intensity of speech. It's a great way to just summarize this in a really easily understandable way. Then you cite it, but because there's 5 authors, you just throw in the first author and then et al. Period, comma, 2021. And so that's paraphrasing. There's no real right or wrong way to paraphrase because any summary of what you're talking about is right. It's right for if it's right for your paper. It's the right way. You've done it the right way. The wrong way would be not paraphrasing, I guess. If you still left a lot of original text in here and it was like pretty much still plagiarized, then you would have paraphrased incorrectly. But again, I mean, like if you paused the video and came up with different ideas for how this should be paraphrased, that's fine. Yeah, it doesn't have to match mine. It's paraphrasing. In fact, the way that when we run these papers through the plagiarism checking software, it's really unlikely, like more chance that you'll just disintegrate into your atoms for no reason than you'll have a paper that's exactly the same as someone else, because you're all paraphrasing things differently. Even if you use the same articles, you're still paraphrasing things differently. To illustrate this point for you, there's a study that I used to do when I taught in psychology about like holding doors. What we would do is we'd have men and women carrying a heavy box, or carrying something or not carrying something. That's what it was. So, 4 different groups: men carrying something, men not carrying something, women carrying something, women not carrying something. And what we wanted to know was like, how often is the door held for them? And when you actually do this, I don't know why I haven't published this, because it's really interesting stuff. And there's like no studies on door holding behavior, which is the point. So there's about 5 that you can find. There's 3 that you can find pretty easily. If you really, really, really dig, you can find like maybe 5. And so everyone in the class, and I did this multiple semesters, so it's everyone in the class like 3 times, found exactly the same articles. Everybody found the same 3. I can almost still remember the name of one of those authors, but it's gone. Anyway, the papers were never the same. Like the plagiarism checking software never flagged anything, even though everybody's citing the same papers, because everybody paraphrases differently. So if you're worried about that, don't be. Everybody's paraphrasing differently. It just isn't going to happen that you're going to have the exact same paper as somebody else. Especially in our class, you're not all doing door holding behavior. You're doing all sorts of different communication disorders. So it's less likely that anybody's even going to use the same disorder. And there's a lot more research on all of those different disorders. So you're safe. Okay. Here's some tips for good paraphrasing. One thing is you should focus on the result, the interesting scientific point, and not the authors. A lot of people will do something like um, DeRoche and colleagues found in their 2021 paper, and then you give the title of the paper, the topic talking drums mimic speech. Don't do that. Do not do that. That's another holdover from like English class. Like again, I have been through those classes. I've been through graduate English classes. They really want you to do this. They'll say things like, "Oh, Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice can be juxtaposed with Marlowe's work of the same period." Like you want to tag the authors and all this stuff. Not in science. What's important in the scientific writing is the finding, right? So in English, which everybody is coming from because you take English 101 and 102, and also you come from high school classes where really they're teaching this English composition thing. It's all about the author. It's about the work because you have to like critique the works and talk about what they did and what they used and stuff like this. So really that's your focus. But with scientific writing, it's not your focus. Your focus is what is the result? What is the science? What and how are we going through those previous results and what and facts that are known in the previous science to get to something that's going to help people, or an idea for a new study that can help people, or a lingering question that's in the research that we want to answer, or something like that. So we're still giving credit to the authors when we put them in the parenthetical documentation, but they're not the thing that we need to focus on in the writing. Your work will flow better also if you just refer to the findings and present them in a logical order. Usually it's a chronological order. You kind of want to go through like the history of how this research in this disorder has progressed. So if you're doing fluency disorders, you'll want to talk about, at first it's thought to be like an anxiety thing, and then people realize, it actually is not an anxiety disorder. It's just modulated by anxiety. And then some research on the brain says that maybe it is the basal ganglia. It's a timing issue, at least for some, for possibly for all, but the research is still ongoing. And then you can move into present day stuff and talk about your idea. Okay, so that's how you do good logical flow. We talk more about logical flow in other slideshows, but just want to hit again that if you're focusing on the result, it flows better because you're just talking about these results. But if you're focusing on the actual authors, there's not really a good way to keep that flow going. So you're just going to jump from one author to another author, and you don't know how they relate to each other, so it doesn't really make a lot of sense. But if you can go from point to point, all of the points and the research and the findings are going to relate to each other. So it's going to feel a lot better. It's going to be easier for you to write. It's going to be more interesting for you to write because nobody cares about the authors of these things. Okay, so what is your assignment? Your assignment is to paraphrase the sentences and paragraphs that I've put into Canvas, and use these tips to help you. Don't quote. Don't copy anything directly. Summarize. Focus on the finding, and then cite the authors in parentheses at the end of your paraphrased sentence. So put those in your brain. Do those. Every time for this assignment, when you're writing your paper, do all these things. Okay. Hopefully you feel better about paraphrasing, and good luck.